Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 706, and today is November 6th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Today's show is going to be a little bit brief. I only slept about 2 hours last night up just kind of watching election coverage, seeing what Trump's victory speech, what the reaction to that was. And so I want to talk a little bit about Trump and what his foreign policy may look like. It'll probably only be like a 10 or 15 minute episode today, so a short one. If you could, please share it out though. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost on the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. You can find it anywhere you listen to audio podcasts, and follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_, where I post every episode of the show, all the articles I write, and other news that I think is important. All right, everybody, let's get into it. So Trump has won the 2024 presidential election here in the United States. It became clear pretty early in the night that things were looking very positive for Trump. By about midnight Eastern time, it was clear that Kamala really didn't have a path to victory. We had somebody from her campaign come out and speak, basically saying that Kamala was not going to address the crowd tonight. As of this recording, we have not heard from her, so we don't have an official concession, although it's hard to imagine that something of that kind is not coming at some point in time today, as all the major media outlets have called the race for Donald Trump. And as we said before, it wasn't a particularly close election. Now, there were a few states that were, determined by a percentage point or two, which, does make it a closer election. But generally speaking, it looks like Trump is now going to go on to sweep the swing states. And so I want to start off more analysis on what Trump's presidency is going to look like than looking back at the election. I think after I have maybe a day or two to kind of process the exit polling and things like that, I may have some more insightful thoughts on what this election actually means. But going forward, Trump is going to be president, return to the Oval Office, and be America's commander-in-chief. And that's really important. And I think that's something that's a little bit easier to talk about because Trump has already been president and we've seen his foreign policy in action. And so I think the most important thing when it comes to American foreign policy, and particularly with Donald Trump, is personnel is policy. Trump could have all the ideas he wants, but he can't implement them if he does not have the right personnel in place. And I'm going to kind of bring to two examples of this: Somalia and Syria during his first election. In both cases, Trump's instincts were to extricate America from these conflict zones. With Somalia, he told his Secretary of Defense, James Mad Dog Mattis, that he wanted to get the hell out of Somalia, and Mattis basically blackmailed him. He said, if anything bad ever happens in Somalia after we leave, I will go to the media and I will blame you for it. And so he basically, not actually tied Trump's hands, because I think Trump could have withdrawn. And if he would come out publicly and said that, my Secretary of Defense essentially tried to blackmail me and I'm coming to you, the American people, to be honest and transparent here and let you know that, yeah, bad things may happen in Somalia one day, but overall it's not America's problem and I'm going to get the American troops out of the danger zone there. Didn't get that done. America actually increased its war in Somalia throughout the Trump years, and it's still ongoing. So that was a big failure. Another one was the war in Syria, where as a candidate in the early days of Trump's presidency, he's actually talking about withdrawing U.S. troops from Syria. Then there's a false flag chemical weapons attack in Khan Sheikhoun, and Trump, I think in part, caught up in the rhetoric of his ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, ends up not staying disengaged, withdrawing from Syria, but actually bombs Bashar al-Assad not once but twice during the first 2 years of his presidency. Then Trump seeks to withdraw from Syria, and one of his envoys to the Middle East, James Jeffries, specifically lied to Donald Trump in order to get him not to withdraw the U.S. troops from that region. And when he finally sent in order to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria, he was convinced by Jack Keane to keep them there. And so if you look at this, USA, Trump had good instincts. He wanted to get out of Syria. There may be some truth to that, but he wasn't able to execute it. Now, people will give Trump credit for ending wars and will often point to Afghanistan. It's important to note that the U.S. didn't leave Afghanistan until after Trump left. And since 2021, when the withdrawal happened, Trump has said that he wasn't actually going to pull all of his force, all American forces out of Afghanistan, and that he was going to keep the Bagram Air Base. And so, I'm not so sure that Trump was as committed to ending this war as we think he was. Now, another place where we could look to Trump's policy and realize it didn't line up with what he ultimately campaigned on, and a lot of what his rhetoric was on China, where Trump said he was going to come into office, Russia, where he was going to come into office and he was going to get along with Vladimir Putin. Instead, he took steps that Barack Obama wasn't even willing to take, shipping arms to the Ukrainians, and I think this was largely as a result of the political pressure from Russiagate. And one of the major problems with Trump is he is never able to really articulate how he's right even when he is. And so when you have the Russiagate, which was a coup attempt against the sitting president of the United States, first to remove him and prevent him from taking office, and then to try to impeach him and hamstring his foreign policy, he was never able to effectively articulate to the American people how that happened and how much the deep state tried to screw him with the whole Russiagate saga. And so, it's nice enough to, and again, that's the case where personnel equals policy, because if it wasn't for him making Jeff Sessions his attorney general, who turns around and appoints Bob Mueller as the, special attorney, prosecutor there to look into all the Russiagate stuff. All this stuff could be quashed very early in his administration. And so until we see who's Trump's personnel is, we're not going to really understand his policy, no matter what the president says. Now, in his victory speech last night, we didn't get any policy, and we didn't get a whole lot in the terms of having a light on personnel. He more thanked J.D. Vance, who's the vice president, and people like Dana White and Elon Musk during his victory speech. The rumors are that Trump is considering Hawks, Mike Pompeo, Tom Cotton for Secretary of Defense, and hawk Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. I think a lot of people are assuming that Robert O'Brien is going to be the national security advisor. And, if we have some combination of those three men in those three positions, I think, again, no matter what Trump's instincts are, we're going to have a very hawkish foreign policy. Now, I guess a couple things I will say that maybe fall into the, let's be a little bit optimistic here and not poo-poo everything. When it comes to the war in Ukraine, Trump did surround himself and make a pretty big deal during his campaign about ending that war. Now, he never articulated how he was going to do that within 24 hours of taking office, but the fact that he has any incentive to all and has any idea at all of ending that war, I think is a positive thing. And that J.D. Vance is his vice president, which indicates that people like his son, Don Jr., and Tucker Carlson do have a lot of influence on this particular administration, may be a decent sign, although, we're reading a lot of the tea leaves here. On China, I don't expect much to change from the course that we are already headed under the Obama-Biden policy, essentially, increase in tariffs, more disruptions with China. Now, when it comes to the Middle East, I think this could go one of two ways. That Trump either really sells the American people out to Israel entirely and we end up in a war with Iran for the benefit of Israel, or the other situation where Trump really doesn't want to embroil Americans in Middle East wars and is willing to de-escalate in places where Biden was not. I've said throughout the past year that there are times where it seems like the White House is giving red lines to Israel. You can't go into Rafah. You have to allow more medical aid or food aid or water into Gaza. And Israel routinely denies Biden. And Biden doesn't face any political or media pressure to live up to his red lines when it comes to Israel. And I think Trump would. And I think Trump probably is the type of man where if he calls you and he feels like you owe him one, or, you know, he's in charge of you like he does with Netanyahu, and he says, Bibi, buddy, pal, you remember when I moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem for you? Well, now, I need you to, you could knock the hell, you could kill everybody you want in northern Gaza, but you can't destroy the southern half of the strip. Or, you could drop all the bombs you want, but you got to allow him more aid. I do think that Trump will be more likely to follow through with those red lines, to threaten to cut off aid to Israel, to get upset with Israel and tell them that they have to end the war in Gaza, Lebanon, West Bank, stop attacking Iran, because Trump doesn't want a major war in the Middle East. And look, we have seen Trump be willing to de-escalate at a time where he didn't necessarily have to. The top examples are after he killed Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, in Baghdad in January of 2020. There was a potential after Iran bombed the Al-Assad air base in Iraq for Trump to significantly escalate and carry out a direct attack on Iran. And he didn't do that. Now, again, this isn't a peacenik. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm not saying that Trump is the anti-war candidate. He killed Qasem Soleimani, an assassination strike at the Baghdad airport, for Israel when Iran and Saudi Arabia were trying to develop ties. So again, this guy clearly isn't a peacenik. He's clearly not for peace. I'm just saying that when push comes to shove and a major war may be on the precipice of breaking out, Trump may be more unwilling to engage in that than Biden or whoever is currently running the Biden government is. We also saw that after Iran downed a U.S. Global Hawk or a Seahawk over the Persian Gulf, there was a lot of calls for Trump to strike Iran at that time, and he didn't move forward with doing so. The worst news on foreign policy, I think, likely comes from Israel, where my guess is that Netanyahu now feels like he has a ticking clock, and that he has until the inauguration of Trump to not maybe wrap up operations in Gaza, but wrap up the major portion of the military operations, the daily having multiple airstrikes, the large deployment of Israeli troops, the blocking of aid from Gaza. I think Netanyahu is going to want to be past this phase of the war when Trump takes office. Now, a part of that isn't because I think Trump is going to necessarily have a more favorable policy towards the Palestinians than Joe Biden did, but because Netanyahu is going to see an opportunity, and this comes in part from the $100 million that Miriam Adelson donated to the Trump campaign to get Trump to go ahead and annex the West Bank. And so I'm not sure that Netanyahu is going to want to risk upsetting Trump by dragging the war out in Gaza when the real prize for Tel Aviv is the West Bank, and that does seem like something that at this point Trump may be okay with letting Israel go ahead and annex. During his first term, it's really important to note that Trump allowed Israel to annex the Golan Heights, or recognize the Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights, and also move the embassy to Jerusalem, which was a real statement that there would be no two-state solution. Trump also introduced the Abraham Accords, which were what they call normalization agreements between Israel and other Gulf Arab states, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. In part that these agreements have fallen apart, but the parts of the agreement that still exist are the benefits the U.S. gave to the UAE and these other countries in the form of lavishing them with weapons and other military aid and, advanced status. Now, Biden has worked very hard to expand this to Saudi Arabia, and it hasn't really panned out, but I could see that being something that Trump does when he returns to office. And I do think that would be a negative. Now, I don't like to buy into this whole, the Trump foreign policy team is a bunch of amateurs and that the real adults in the room, like the Joe Biden team, know what they're doing. One of the places where I'm actually a little bit concerned about Trump giving away too much would be with Saudi Arabia and a potential deal. Now, this is saying a lot because Joe Biden was talking about giving Saudi Arabia a Japan-style defense pact, but I think it's not impossible that Trump gives them essentially an unregulated nuclear energy program, which will allow them to make their program into nuclear weapons if they so chose at a later date. So there's a lot here. The one thing I will say on the election results is I don't watch a whole lot of mainstream media. I don't spend a lot of time watching CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Rarely, if ever, do I actually put it on TV. If I have it on, it's usually a clip just to see, what this person or that person said on the network. But yesterday, in at times with big moments, I do think it's helpful to sit down and see what they're saying in the mainstream media to get an idea of what they're going to be telling my fellow American citizens about why Kamala Harris lost the election. And so, again, in the coming days, we're going to learn more about how much foreign policy weighed on this election and if it really was a big factor in it. The size of Trump's victory makes me think that the victory is largely based on the economy. That, as I have been saying for months on this show, that the cost of living is just getting too expensive in the United States of America, and that, combined with Biden's decline, the debate, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, just made all those factors are so big and so much to overcome that Trump won the election. But let's say the election did come down to Michigan. I think in that case, then it really would have been an election decided on foreign policy, where you're looking at some of these little precincts and they're reporting 22% for Jill Stein, and Kamala Harris is also in the 20% bracket. And so it does seem that this foreign policy strategy of rather than trying to rally progressives and Muslims to vote for Harris versus third-party Trump or staying home, they chose to try to invigorate the Liz Cheney Republicans, the Nikki Haley Republicans, to come out and vote for Kamala Harris. Don't know if that... Well, obviously it didn't work because she didn't win. I'm not sure if that particular strategy didn't work because they don't like the Cheneys or because everything just seems so hollow, as Kamala Harris was helping the White House wage a genocide in Gaza. All right, everyone, I want to talk about one news story today. Well, I guess two, because I believe Netanyahu was the first world leader to tweet out a congratulation on Trump. I want to say it came maybe within 10 minutes of his victory speech wrapping up. Netanyahu congratulates Trump on winning the election. But we had this major story yesterday, and I feel like it happened on the American election day for a reason, so I want to talk about it today. And that is Netanyahu fires Defense Minister Gallant. This one from Dave DeCamp, November 5th, antiwar.com. On Tuesday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced that he fired Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who was recently calling for Israel to make painful concessions to reach a hostage deal with Hamas. Netanyahu's office said in a statement, "Unfortunately, over the past months, the trust between me and the Minister of Defense has broken. There were significant gaps regarding the management of the military campaign, and these gaps were accompanied by statements and actions that contradict the decisions of the government and the cabinet." Gallant is set to be replaced by Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz. Gideon Sidar, a former Netanyahu rival who joined the government after Israel's dramatic escalations in Lebanon in September, will replace Katz as foreign minister. Netanyahu's decision to fire Gallant was slammed by the Hostage and Missing Families Forum, which represents relatives of Israeli hostages in Gaza. According to Haaretz, the group said the firing was a part of Netanyahu's efforts to torpedo any chances of a hostage deal with Hamas. The firing was praised by Israel Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir, who called for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza and wants the establishment of Jewish settlements in the Strip. "I congratulate the Prime Minister on the decision to dismiss Gallant. With Gallant, who is still deeply trapped in his own conception, it is impossible to achieve victory," Ben-Gvir said. And one more thing I'll mention about Trump here. I think it's something that will really determine his Middle East policy is how much influence Jared Kushner has in his incoming administration. I think where you see Donald Trump Jr. maybe being a little bit less hawkish. Kushner is very hawkish, especially when it comes to the Middle East, and particularly when with Israel. Netanyahu is his godfather. He talks about how he gave up his room so Netanyahu could sleep in it when he was a kid, and so obviously there's a lot of personal ties there and a lot of reasons that Kushner would be very favorable towards Netanyahu and the Israelis. And so if he has a lot of influence, that's probably going to impact Trump's policy quite a bit. Again, personnel is policy. Israeli opposition parties call for protests against Netanyahu over the firing, and thousands of demonstrators took to the streets in Tel Aviv. Netanyahu and Gallant have been at odds over much of the past year. In August, Gallant called Netanyahu's goal of a total victory in Gaza nonsense. Gallant has repeatedly called for deals with Hamas, but made clear that he only wants a temporary deal and didn't want the genocidal war to end. Comments from Gallant in October of 2023 are often cited as evidence of Israel's genocidal intent in Gaza. On October 9th, 2023, Gallant ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip and said Israel was fighting human animals. Katz, Gallant's replacement, has also called for a total siege. He said, at the time, humanitarian aid to Gaza, no electrical switch will be turned on, no water hydrants will be opened, and no fuel truck will enter until the Israeli abductees are returned home. Humanitarianism for humanitarianism, and no one will preach us morality. All right, everybody, that's the show for today. Hope you all got a little bit of sleep with the elections last night. At least, I will say, this is the one positive thing I will say about the U.S. government right now. They did get the election, buttoned up pretty quickly here. We're not waiting days and days and days for the result, which is, I think, a very good thing for the country. And with that, I'll wrap it up. Again, back with more tomorrow. We'll have plenty of news later in the week and much more analysis on the Trump victory.